All right. As I said, when I first saw the story a couple of days ago, I kind of shook my head and went, wait a sec. No, we don't deal with tuberculosis anymore. This is, 50 years or 70 years ago, maybe. But then I see there are two cases of tuberculosis that have been confirmed in Montreal in the East End, Mercier-Hochelaga district. And I thought we better find out more because, let's face it, there has been a lot of anti-vax reaction. And some of those people who choose not to get, vaccines or to take antibiotics for tuberculosis for whatever reason, maybe you're making a big mistake. But I thought rather than me speculate, let's talk to Dr. Chris Labos. He's a cardiologist with a degree in epidemiology. He's a regular, of course, here on CJAD. Chris, tuberculosis, as I said, I thought we were done with this a long time ago. What's going on here?
Well, the unfortunate reality is that we're not done with tuberculosis. And while we don't see very much of it, in Montreal, in most of the urban centers in North America, globally, it's still a major problem. And in the north of Quebec, especially amongst the native populations, it has always remained a big problem. So it's unfortunately one of the situations where out of sight means out of mind. And so we stopped thinking about it. And yet globally, and in terms of public health, it remains a significant issue, mainly because we can't get the treatment and the resources to the people who need it.
Okay, so am I then sort of off track here, suggesting that part of maybe why we're seeing a comeback, if you can call it that at least, is because of vaccine hesitancy or antibiotic hesitancy?
Well, I think there's a few issues that are in it. I mean, there is a vaccine against tuberculosis. We tend not to use it that much anymore. It wasn't all that effective. It had some value. And people who were born in sort of Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, may have gotten the vaccine as a child. We don't tend to give it in North America because the reason why we don't see tuberculosis anymore here is because we can treat it with antibiotics. The problem is that it's not a 2-week course of antibiotics, like if you had a urinary tract infection, if you had a pneumonia, urinary tract infection would just be a few days of antibiotics. It is months-long antibiotic therapy and sort of making sure that you have the resources and the follow-up in place to make sure that people are getting their antibiotics and taking them regularly is why it's so hard to get rid of tuberculosis in some of the more remote parts of Canada and globally. How much is, anti-science, anti-vaccine, anti-medicine treatment, how much is that philosophy playing into it? I think to a certain extent, sort of distrust in science, sort of the anti-establishment messages that are going on there will potentially make somebody less willing to comply with treatment. And this idea of doctors don't know best, I know best, I'm going to do what's right for me, I think is certainly contributing to the issue. I think the reason why we haven't seen a huge explosion right now is because, at least here in Montreal, at least in the urban centers, when somebody's diagnosed, they are usually treated. Why this is making the news now is because when you have these cases pop up like this, public health really does have to ramp up into gear to do contact tracing to make sure that everybody that was potentially exposed to these index cases gets tested, gets treated. That's how you prevent the spread of tuberculosis. That's why we don't have, people being sent off to sanitariums the way we would have 50, 60, 70 years ago.
So if I read this right, though, my understanding is, first of all, it's contagious, which is, scary enough. And second of all, the cases that we're talking about here, these two particular cases in the city, it took how long for symptoms to actually tell us this was tuberculosis? Did I read this right? 6 months?
Yeah, so you're right. Tuberculosis is very, very infectious. It's funny in that in the pre-COVID era, when we talked about airborne spread of diseases, we only talked about them for two diseases, measles and tuberculosis. For everything else, we were still talking about droplets, and that's where the whole, 6 feet and thing came from. And I think we have a much better understanding and a much better realization that many things are airborne spread. But tuberculosis is very, very infectious, much like measles. And that's why we used to talk about airborne spread. So one person who is sick can actually infect a lot of people. The reason why it takes so long to make a diagnosis is because, well, first of all, people aren't thinking tuberculosis the way they would have 50, 60 years ago because it is so relatively rare in Montreal, but it's actually harder to make a diagnosis. Yet the bacteria are hard to grow in a lab. You have to get a good sputum sample, and somebody who's coughing and, may not go see a doctor, it can take a while for a diagnosis to be made or for symptoms to get bad enough for somebody to seek medical attention, especially if they don't have a family doctor. So it is, in one sense, shocking and disappointing, but maybe it shouldn't be surprising us as much as it does because this is what happens when the healthcare system starts to unravel. It's not the hospital on fire and panic in the streets. it's stuff that should be straightforward, taking longer and longer to happen in cases like this falling through the cracks.
So if I can, are you worried of a spread here? I know it's just 2 cases, but as we said, it is contagious. Are there things to be conscious of? And what are symptoms here, by the way?
Well, tuberculosis can be a very complex disease, and some people can harbor tuberculosis in their bodies for years. That's what what we used to call latent tuberculosis. The bacteria is in there, and it won't cause any symptoms, but it can reactivate at some future point in time. The classical symptoms are essentially a very bad pneumonia. You're coughing, sometimes coughing up blood. It's a very bad lung infection that can really damage your lungs. So, I don't think it's going to be a big risk here in the case that I don't think we're going to start seeing hundreds and thousands of cases of tuberculosis in Montreal because we know how to deal with it. Public health is ramping up into gear. You contact trace everybody. You test them for tuberculosis. You give them the course of antibiotics. We know how to eradicate tuberculosis. We've done it, right? We don't have tuberculosis cases much in Montreal anymore. I think the real worry is not so much here, but if you start cutting resources to public health, much as they're doing in the U.S., do you start losing the capacity to do stuff like this, and do things slowly start to unravel, and do you start having not a drastic deterioration, but a slow and steady deterioration in public health where diseases that were once forgotten are now starting to make a comeback, and we're starting to see the early hints of maybe us getting into that situation. So it's more of a long-term concern that if we don't keep up the fight, as it were, things could continue to worsen.
I want to just go back to that for a second. You talk about diseases that we don't talk about anywhere. What are we looking here? I mean, is typhus coming back? Is scurvy on the way? Or is it the Black Plague we have to worry about? What's going on? Why are these coming back?
Well, you joke about scurvy. In fact, I think it was last fall in Ontario, there were a couple of cases of scurvy, and that was because the affordability crisis, people not being able to access, fresh food and vegetables, and actually getting vitamin C deficiency. As shocking as that sounds, that actually did happen here in Canada. But this is the problem, right? A lot of these things are manageable. Now, a lot of them are manageable with adequate resources, making sure people have enough to eat, clean drinking water, and at least in the urban centers of Canada, that's still okay. Part of the problems why we start seeing stuff like this, especially in native reserves, is we have a chronic issue there with no clean drinking water. Many native reserves are still under boiled water advisory, sometimes for years. Right. I mean, that is kind of shameful in Canada that we're still doing that. So the more you let things slip, the more you say, this is not that bad, I'm okay, that's when you start having situations like this. And it's not a drastic decline. We're sort of like the frog in the pot that's slowly getting boiled. Things get a little bit worse every year. And unless somebody sort of issues a wake-up call and course corrects, they just continue to get a little bit worse every year, drop by drop by drop by drop. And simple things don't get fixed.
Well, thanks for the encouraging news, Chris. That's wonderful. Listen, I always appreciate you weighing in on this, so thank you so much.
My pleasure. Take care.
Dr. Chris Lai. By the way, you can hear him on the weekends. He's here every Sunday with Joanne Vrakas at 7:20 a.m. Imagine that. Leprosy coming out. I mean, it's kind of crazy. But to his point, you know what? Maybe it's not.